It was a cold, dreary night when I first took on the graveyard shift at Crestfield Cemetery. I didn't mind working nights. In fact, I preferred the quiet, the solitude. What I didn't anticipate was how the silence could warp, twist itself into something far more sinister when you were surrounded by the dead. The cemetery had been around for centuries, the gravestones worn down by time and weather. It was a sprawling, labyrinthine place with large mausoleums and overgrown paths. My job was simple: walk the grounds, ensure no one was trespassing, and lock up the main gates at midnight. Easy money for a few hours of work, or so I thought. That first night, everything was normal enough. The sky was overcast, the moon occasionally peeking out from behind the thick clouds. I made my rounds with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dense fog that seemed to cling to the ground like a living thing. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the occasional rustling of leaves. Around 1 a.m., I was standing near the north end of the cemetery, where the older graves were, some dating back to the 1800s. That's when I noticed it. The air changed. It grew colder, unnaturally so, and an overwhelming sense of being watched washed over me. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow darting between the gravestones. At first, I thought it might be a stray animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But the way it moved, it was too fast, too fluid. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the movement, but there was nothing there. Just an endless row of gravestones, their inscriptions weathered and illegible. Probably just my mind playing tricks, I muttered to myself, though my pulse quickened. I turned to continue my patrol, trying to shake the creeping unease that had settled into my bones. But then I heard it, soft, barely audible at first. A voice, whispering, "Help me." I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably real. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the cemetery. My rational mind told me to leave it alone, to walk away and not investigate. But against my better judgment, I found myself drawn toward the sound, like some invisible force was pulling me in. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast, empty space. No response. I kept walking, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. "Help me, please." I stopped in front of an old crypt, the stone door slightly ajar. A shiver ran down my spine. The voice was coming from inside. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open further, the hinges creaking ominously. The smell hit me first, damp earth and decay. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping across the dark, narrow space. It was empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. But then I noticed the coffin in the corner, its lid slightly askew. My breath caught in my throat. There was something wrong here, something deeply unsettling. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it, a hand, pale and emaciated, sticking out from beneath the coffin lid. My blood ran cold. "No, no way," I whispered, backing away slowly. Suddenly, the hand moved. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. My mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. And yet, the hand was still there, twitching, as if trying to pull itself free. I bolted for the door, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I reached the exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one could hear me. I was alone in this tomb, surrounded by death and darkness. The whispering started again, closer this time, like it was right in my ear. "Help me." I spun around, my back pressed against the cold stone door. The coffin lid was now completely off, and the figure inside was slowly sitting up. Its face was gaunt, eyes sunken and hollow, skin stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. It looked at me, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear as it began to speak in that same, soft whisper. "Join me." Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, my breath visible in the air. The fog from outside seemed to seep into the crypt, swirling around my feet. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, trapped by some unseen force. The figure rose from the coffin, its movements slow and deliberate. It reached out toward me with its bony hand, the skin on its fingers stretched tight and cracking. I could hear the faint sound of bones creaking, like dry wood being bent. Don't come any closer," I managed to choke out, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. The figure ignored me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from every corner of the crypt now. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. Then, just as the figure's hand was about to touch my face, the door flew open with a deafening crash. Light flooded the crypt, blinding me. I blinked, disoriented, and when my vision cleared, the figure was gone. I didn't waste a second. I bolted out of the crypt, gasping for air as I stumbled into the open air. The cold night breeze hit me like a wave, but I didn't care. I was free, away from whatever nightmare had taken hold inside that crypt. I ran, my feet pounding the gravel path as I made my way back to the cemetery office. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside and lock the door behind me. Once inside, I collapsed into the chair, my heart still racing. What the hell had just happened? Was it real, or had my mind played some horrible trick on me? The room felt suffocating, and I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, for help. But as I grabbed the phone, the lights flickered. And then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was right behind me. "Help me." I spun around in my chair, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. There was no one there. But I could feel it. I wasn't alone. The door creaked open slowly, the air in the room turning cold once again. The fog rolled in, seeping through the crack beneath the door, swirling around my feet. And then I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the same figure from the crypt, its hollow eyes fixed on mine, that same grotesque smile spreading across its face. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't move, wouldn't respond, as the figure stepped closer, its whisper filling the room. "Join me." The last thing I remember before everything went black was the cold touch of its hand on my skin, the world spinning around me as darkness swallowed me whole. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The world around me was dark, but this darkness was different, heavier, oppressive. My body felt sluggish, like I was submerged in some thick, suffocating fog. It took a moment for me to realize that I was still in the cemetery office. But something was wrong. The air was thick with a strange, metallic smell, and the lights were out. Only the dim glow from the moon, partially blocked by the thick fog outside, filtered through the small windows. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My mind was still foggy, struggling to make sense of what had happened. That figure, had it touched me? Had it pulled me into some nightmare? I stood, legs trembling beneath me, and stumbled toward the door. My breath came out in short, ragged gasps, and I could still feel that freezing cold in my bones. I needed to get out. I needed to leave the cemetery before something worse happened. As I reached for the doorknob, a strange sound echoed from outside. It was faint, like distant wailing, carried on the wind. I froze, my hand hovering over the knob. The wailing grew louder, more distinct, like the anguished cries of someone or something that was lost. I hesitated, fear creeping up my spine like icy fingers. But staying inside felt even more dangerous. I had to move, had to get away from whatever was haunting me. With a deep breath, I threw open the door and stepped out into the night. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the gravestones like it was alive. The temperature had dropped even further, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The wailing continued, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. I glanced around, my flashlight barely cutting through the mist. The cemetery looked different, like the layout had changed somehow. The gravestones were twisted, distorted, and I couldn't see the path that I had walked just hours earlier. I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or which direction led to the exit. I started walking, my footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel, trying to keep calm. But with every step I took, the wailing grew louder, closer. It was as if the cemetery itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Suddenly, the fog shifted, parting like a curtain to reveal something standing in the distance. At first, I thought it was another gravestone, but as my flashlight beam passed over it, I saw it move. A figure. Tall, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It stood completely still, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The same figure from the crypt. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how far I retreated, the figure didn't move. It just watched me, unblinking, that twisted smile still etched onto its face. My mind raced. Was I still in the real world? Or had I crossed into some kind of nightmare realm? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The fog closed in around me, thick and suffocating, and I could barely see where I was going. The ground beneath me felt uneven, like the earth itself was shifting, trying to trip me up. Then I heard it, a soft whisper in my ear, too close to be real. Help me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood turning to ice. The whisper was different this time. It wasn't just a disembodied voice. It was coming from someone or something right behind me. Slowly, trembling, I turned around. The figure was there, standing inches from me, its hand outstretched. But this time, there was something else, something in its eyes. It wasn't just malevolent. There was desperation there, a pleading look, as if it was trapped in its own nightmare. I took a step back, my heart racing, and then the figure did something I hadn't expected. It spoke, its voice no longer a whisper but a hoarse, rasping sound. Free me. The words hung in the air, thick with sorrow and fear. I stared at the figure, trying to comprehend what it meant. Free it? How? From what? The fog swirled around us, and suddenly, I felt something cold and sharp brush against my skin. I gasped, instinctively backing away, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes, waiting for something. And then I saw it. Behind the figure, faint at first but growing stronger, was the outline of another presence. A shadow, darker than the night itself, hovering just beyond the fog. It didn't have a form, not exactly, but I could feel the malevolence radiating from it. That's when I realized this figure wasn't the real threat. It was trapped here, a puppet for something far worse. The shadow, whatever it was controlling everything. The wailing intensified, the cries of the damned echoing through the cemetery. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. I could feel the shadow drawing closer, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second I stood there. I had to make a choice. I could run, try to escape, leave the figure to whatever fate awaited it. Or I could face the shadow, confront whatever darkness was holding this place in its grip, and try to free the figure, and myself, from this nightmare. Without fully understanding why, I chose the latter. Taking a deep breath, I stepped toward the figure. Its eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by my approach. The shadow loomed larger behind it, a hulking mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "Free me," the figure repeated, its voice trembling. I nodded, though I had no idea what to do. I reached out, my hand trembling as I made contact with the figure's cold, skeletal hand. As soon as our skin touched, a surge of energy shot through me, and I felt the air around us crackle with tension. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. I could feel its anger, its desperation, as it tried to maintain control. But I didn't let go. I gripped the figure's hand tighter, pouring every ounce of my will into breaking the connection between the shadow and the figure. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The wailing ceased, the fog stilled, and everything was silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the shadow exploded outward, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The figure collapsed to the ground, its body crumbling into dust as the last vestiges of the shadow's influence faded away. I stood there, breathless, watching as the fog began to lift, revealing the cemetery in its true form. The gravestones were no longer twisted and distorted. The air no longer felt suffocating. It was over. The nightmare had ended. But I knew, deep down, that this place wasn't truly free. Whatever darkness had haunted the cemetery for centuries was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to strike. I turned and walked back toward the main gates, my legs heavy with exhaustion. As I reached the exit, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just an empty, silent graveyard. I stepped through the gates and into the cold night air, my heart still pounding in my chest. The world outside felt different now, brighter, lighter. But the memory of what had happened in the cemetery would stay with me forever. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. The shadow was gone, but its presence still lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that some nightmares never truly fade. And as I disappeared into the night, I knew that one day, it would return.